Thank you so much, David. I'm delighted to be here this afternoon. I wanted to introduce Amy. Amy Fried is the John Mitchell Nickerson Professor of Political Science at the University of Maine. She's the author of Muffled Echoes, Oliver North, and also The Politics of Public Opinion and Pathways to Polling, Crisis, Cooperation, and the Making of Public Opinion. The work she's sharing today is captured in the book that she released just last year, At War with Government, How Conservatives Weaponize Distrust from Goldwater to Trump. And it's co-authored with Douglas Harris. When this project began just over 2 decades ago, I'm certain very few of us were aware how profoundly distrust would shape our policies and outcomes. So I wanted to welcome Amy in particular because I've known her longer than I probably should admit. My husband was a research assistant in the political science department at the University of Minnesota when Amy was working on her PhD. So we've known each other a long time, and I actually visited Amy in Bangor, Maine in 2019 and had a nice tour of town, including seeing Stephen King's house, well, from the outside. So Amy's gonna share her insights on her research, enlighten us on what we can learn from the history, and explore how trust may be recovered. We'll have plenty of time for questions, mostly at the end, but we'll have a little break in the middle. And she'll answer questions about the topic today, but she's also an expert in things, other topics like polling and Maine politics, and even a local prominent Oliver North. So I welcome you, Amy, to Encore Learning, and so nice to have you here today.
Well, thank you so much, Laura. And, thank you for that lovely introduction. And, regarding Bangor, Maine and Stephen King, I just want to mention that he's a big supporter, along with his wife, Tabitha King, also an author of libraries, and has given a lot of money to help the Bangor Public Library, which has a very, very high usage of its books, as well as some other libraries in Maine and perhaps outside of Maine, but I know about the Maine ones more. So he's been a great community member, actually. And I'll just take a second and share my screen to show you my PowerPoint as I talk. Let's see, starting from the beginning here. Great. So as you know, this is the title of the talk, The Road to Recovering Political Trust in the United States. And I am a professor of political science at the University of Maine, where I do a lot of research on the history of American political thought, American political development, and certainly American public opinion, among some other things. Do some teaching on public policy at times as well. And what I'm talking to you today about is this whole issue of distrust in government. And in some ways, distrust in government is something that has been around in the United States for a very long time. I mean, we certainly can think of it as going back really to the founding, if not before the founding, a certain unhappiness with the concentration of political power, particularly when there's a lack of representation. And there's really a long strand of distrust in government that goes through all of American politics. And in fact, I talk about that in the book that this write about that in the talk of in the book that this talk is based upon. It is a very, very long trend. On the other hand, it's something that really came to the fore in more recent decades because of the intensity of the distrust and the kinds of effects of the distrust. So today I'm talking about it a little bit as a trend in the modern period, although, as I said, the book does talk about it through a much longer historical period of time. And we also offer evidence-based ideas on how and why to counter it. It was very clear when working on the book that I wanted to have some possibilities of what could be done. there's too many books, in my view, that I read that are giving a big analysis of a problem, but they don't really come up with specific things to do. And if they do, sometimes they're very vague and kind of signaling at, let's just try to do something, rather than really looking at some of the research on what tends to work. However, what I wanted to do before launching into my description of the problem, the book's description of the problem, and then going to the question of what to do about, to start with why this matters. Why should we even care about levels of trust and distrust in government? So really, the reasons why the levels of trust matter, in my view, rests on some really big assumptions about government. First is simply that we need to have government for certain public purposes, as I say here, such as securing rights, providing services, and countering private power. There are things that have to be done. If they're going to be done, they have to be done as a group in a collective way, and can't be done simply by individuals providing them for themselves. And of course, what that means over time, what are considered to be the valid and legitimate public purposes, are going to change depending on time and depending on place. What people wanted to do in the United States in 1800 in terms of the public purposes, not exactly the same as what we want to do now, for sure. And we have a lot of shifts in what level of government is seen as important and should be providing it, with a big growth in the role of the federal government versus the states. However, really, these three ideas that I have listed here, in some ways, really are shared views at some level over a very long period of time, and really can be traced back to political theorists that affected the founders, such as, John Locke, for example, who had a big impact on Thomas Jefferson, the Virginian. Where Jefferson, in writing the Declaration of Independence, says government, secures certain rights. That's a purpose that comes straight from Locke. And at the same time, we know that there are certain kinds of services or needs that people have collectively that can only be provided from government. Maybe early on, things like in the Constitution, listing the postal service, postal roads, security apparatuses through the military, but also for countering private power through various kinds of regulations. And so we need to have government to do that. And even though we think a lot of times, I think a lot of people are going to say, well, what are the resources you need to support government? They'd say, well, we need to raise money to do these things. You also have to have a certain base level of legitimacy for that government. At the same time, although we want government to exist, we need government to exist for these public purposes, it is also true that you need to have a certain amount of skepticism about government and elected officials if you're going to hold people accountable and make them responsive. There's lots of different mechanisms of accountability. Voting is, the primary one. You can take people out of office if they haven't performed well. Responsiveness can also happen through the vote, but also through different ways of contacting people and organizing in response to that. So it's really important, I think, to clarify that although I'm talking about trust as being necessary and a resource in order to perform these public kinds of purposes, that doesn't at all mean that people should blindly trust the government or trust the government in every respect. And certainly I would say I have my own list of things that where I could point to historically or even today and say these are places that we really have to be particularly skeptical or wary about government, and different people will vary in terms of what those happen to be. So far I've said we need government, it serves public purposes, but skepticism about government is absolutely essential. However, as I've already implied to some extent, I think, and I would argue that it is damaging when we shift from this kind of healthy distrust, this healthy skepticism, to delegitimizing government and even democracy. We need that base sense that the governmental system is legitimate in order for government to work and perform the functions that we need. And, one example of this more dangerous kind of distrust comes from, what happened on January 6, 2021, the insurrection at the Capitol, where really this view that the government, that there had been this stolen election and that you couldn't trust the results, led to all of these kinds of events. And I have an image here and a little bit from an indictment from the Oath Keeper leader, Stuart Rhodes, for seditious conspiracy, where he says, 2 days after the election, we aren't getting through this without a civil war. Too late for that. Prepare your mind, body, spirit. So, when you get to the point that distrust is so severe that it's gone from healthy skepticism and distrust to really delegitimizing, you can have this kind of violence that results from it. Okay. Another case in which trust and distrust really mattered is that distrust mattered in responding to the pandemic. And, we're still kind of responding to the pandemic, even though numbers have gone down recently. Cases and deaths have decreased for a time after the Omicron surge. But clearly, there were a lot of statements that were made by various leaders who really tended to present the idea that some of the public health endeavors were things that shouldn't have been done and that were really driven not by a desire to protect health and save lives, but really for some other reason, to try to exert political power over other people. And I have a few examples here on that slide. One quote from the governor of Nebraska, Pete Ricketts, who, in talking about the workplace vaccine or test policy that the Biden administration put out, said, "This plan isn't about public health. This is about government control and taking away personal liberties." And, a story about Marjorie Taylor Greene calling people leading vaccination efforts medical brown shirts. This kind of rhetoric was not terribly uncommon and perhaps has died away a bit because of the pushback, especially on the kind of Nazi language. There was a state representative in my state, the state of Maine, who said similar kinds of things using Nazi kind of language, language about Nazis and the Holocaust, who got a lot of pushback. So some of that has died down. Some of that rhetoric has died down. But really behind it is this notion that what was being done was not legitimate, not just not good policy, but really seriously illegitimate and being done in order to take power over other people. And there's a difference there. You can dislike a policy, think it's not a good policy, but at the same time, not impute the motivation to the desire to have a lot of power over other people. The result ultimately was not just this rhetoric, but having, some parts of the population completely refusing to get vaccinated, having higher levels of deaths really in certain areas of the country as a result of that. And possibly also maybe there will be some ongoing medical issues in those areas as well from long COVID and the like. So in any case, my point is that distrust matters. So how did we get here? Well, there was a the polling on trust and distrust doesn't go back that long. A lot of the major polls that look at this, that are public polls at least, start to be done in the 1950s. There's some polling in the United States earlier than that, which if you're really interested, as Laura mentioned, I wrote a book called Pathways to Polling, which has an awful lot about polling in the 1930s and the 1940s primarily. But the big national polls that are public polls really start to see in the 1950s. And the polls that do this, you start to see a big drop in the early 1960s. The Pew poll has a high point of trust in government in, I believe it's about 68%, 69%, right before the 1964 presidential election. And then it starts to drop. So if you look today at a Pew poll and other polls like that, and you have questions like, you know, how much should you trust what government does all the time? So, you know, most of the time, some of the time, not at all, you know, whatever. You know, the big drop of people who want to trust the government, at least some of the time, comes after 1964. And now we're down at about 26%. So that's a, you know, that's a huge decline. And political scientists have looked at this question quite a bit to try to understand what happened. And in some ways, there's some very good explanations. There's certainly very good analysis about the impact of particular events and particular political shifts, some of which I could address more maybe in the Q&A, not to go into it in too much detail. But obviously, there's a great deal of political upheaval in the 1960s between responses to the Vietnam War. You have a lot of civil rights activities. You have big political shifts where the South stops being so much of a Democratic area and starts to become more a Republican area, particularly by the end of the decade and into the early 1970s. There are a lot of things that happen in that period. And a lot of political scientists look at that and also look at demographic changes. And my co-author, Douglas Harris, and I don't disagree with that. And really, that's at least part of what happened. However, we add an additional component to this, which is to look at really the political elements of what happened, that it didn't just sort of happen. It wasn't just, you know, this inadvertent thing, that different things happen in the world and distrust tended to fall as a result, but that distrust was encouraged, and it was, in our language, weaponized. It was used as a political weapon or a political tool to try to create certain kinds of political benefits. Okay, and I'll just mention also, since you're in Virginia, that in another state that's not too far from you, Maryland, is where Doug Harris is. He teaches at Loyola University, Maryland. So he's in that region more generally. Okay, and just very briefly, the sources of evidence this book drew upon were various statistics, all kinds of writings from scholarly journals to contemporary news media over these periods, public statements, occasionally an interview, although I didn't put that down, and archival research. This was a document from the Clinton healthcare debates from the Clinton Library in Little Rock, Arkansas. So we, got a lot of documents from presidential libraries and various members of Congress, etc. Okay, so getting back to the core argument here about weaponizing distrust, our argument is that political distrust has been a political tool, and we say it's used strategically for 4 main reasons. One is that distrust is helpful for organizations. By an organization, I mean anything from a political party to just a freestanding group or groups that work together in different kinds of coalitions. How can it be a political tool? Well, it's something that becomes a kind of organizing principle or an organizing argument that draws together different groups and different individuals and helps them attract members and maintain themselves as organizations and thrive as organizations. So it becomes it's good and helpful for those organizations. Political distrust is. It also is used more specifically in waging election campaigns. So, using messages of distrust to make arguments about why, this particular candidate or political party should do well in an election and why you should not support this other candidate or political party. So it's been used that way quite a bit. Those first two, maybe even the second is the most clear and obvious one of these, perhaps. The third might be is a little bit more complex, perhaps, but we talk about distrust as being used in reshaping institutional power, where if you are you can use messages of distrust, or we see people having used messages of distrust to try to move power from the institutions that they don't control to the ones that they do control, and then sometimes changing very quickly in how they see that. So, I'll be talking about all of these in a little more detail, but just to give you a little sense of this institutional one for a moment, think of all the battles over executive power. At certain points, you will have criticism of the president of having too much power, and then when your party is in power and has the presidency, then you argue against the president having so much power and try to move power, say, towards Congress. And the last, which I think, there's a lot of very good examples for, is distrust being used in waging policy battles. So in talking about these four, I've said a party, an organization, a candidate, that sort of thing. As the subtitle of the book, however, states, and as our argument states, this is something that is done primarily, we argue, by American conservatives, not only by American conservatives, but primarily in the US context, it's conservatives that make these kinds of arguments, and is really more consonant with their ideological positions in any case. Okay, so over time in the book, we chronicle these decades of generators of distrust that are both, similar in a lot of ways because they use distrust in those four ways that I've already stated, but at the same time, they're somewhat different. So one of our chapters is about Ronald Reagan, Reagan's presidency, and Reagan famously said, government is not the solution to our problem, government is the problem. However, he was also somebody who had been a governor. He was governor of California, and he wanted to govern. He didn't really want to tear down government. He wanted to cut back government, certainly. Some of you may agree or disagree with this characterization, but he didn't have he didn't have the certain intensity that you see developing later on in terms of really going after one's opponents in a much more negative way. And a lot of that happens in the Clinton years with the relation, with the Republicans in Congress and under the leadership of Newt Gingrich and others. In the Obama years, you have the development of the Tea Party, and you have a lot of racialized messages against Obama. This one that's up there from the from a CNN story, and then with Donald Trump, really a very negative vision of government, and in some respects, in him labeling a lot of the federal government, or certainly large portions of the federal government, the deep state, and obviously very negative characterizations of one's opponents and the press by Trump. As I've already suggested, showing you that little image of the, from the Tea Party days, you sometimes do get these kinds of racialized messages, and this is a cartoon that uses that welfare queen trope of, some people are benefiting from public programs more than others, connecting that with African Americans often. And so you get these messages, sometimes implicit, sometimes more explicit, often in making arguments about government and government programs, which are very much linked to this idea of who deserves to get help from government. And there are many examples of that. But that's just one of them. Another place where you very much see these messages of distrust comes up in health policy. And should you read this book, if you haven't, maybe some of you have read it, but should you read this book, you'll see that we have a policy that runs all through it, that gets discussed through a lot of the different chapters, which is health policy. The first proposals really to do anything when it comes to some kind of national health policy go back to the presidency of Harry Truman, although Franklin Roosevelt did want to do that after the war. I've read some of the memos from from his papers from the Roosevelt Library talking about that's what they wanted to do. It's something that is in fact mentioned by Roosevelt in his so-called second Bill of Rights, the right to health care. And then, we've gone through many decades of trying to expand healthcare, with a couple of major times when it was attempted, and really a couple times where it succeeded in a pretty serious way. The first being, of course, under Lyndon Johnson with Medicare and Medicaid. The second effort with Bill Clinton, which did not succeed, although he did then pass the Children's Health Insurance Program, the CHIP program, and then the Affordable Care Act under Obama. And in all of these times, there has been a lot of language about trust and not wanting to trust the federal government to take power when it comes to healthcare. And here's just a couple of examples on the slide from that failed effort, the effort under Bill Clinton, where various members of Congress said these things. I don't have to read them to you, but basically talking about freedom, talking about the damage that would be done to one's loved ones if there's any, if there's this expansion of healthcare. And this cartoon, I think, gives a sense of that kind of scare effort about it. If you can see it, I'll read you just at the bottom of this cartoon. It says, "The ever vigilant Department of Motor Vehicles, retrained and retooled, tackles the problem of universal health care." And the guy is like dying on the floor, and these people are sitting there forever, and one of them has a skull there. So if you expand healthcare, if you move towards some kind of universal healthcare, this is what you're going to end up, this very, very frightening sort of situation, throwing around the word socialism a lot. That's part of the effort. And with the Clinton healthcare effort, this is a very good example of attempting to defeat the policy for electoral benefits in a very straightforward way. So there were some memos written at the time where, from the right, from conservatives, talking about the proposal as being a serious political threat for the Republican Party. So again, not just saying this is a bad idea, it's bad public policy, which of course is always a legitimate thing for people to have arguments about what's good public policy, but saying explicitly that this is something that will hurt the Republican Party. So it should be defeated in order to make this kind of political benefit. So this is a good example of a policy benefit for promoting distrust in government, working against this healthcare policy for a political reason, for a political benefit. Okay. What this institutional thing that I've mentioned, the use of distrust as a political tool in terms of an institutional benefit, here's an example of what I was mentioning in terms of executive power, where Republicans in their platform criticized Obama and talked about that in terms of antipathy towards the Constitution, appointing SARs, recess appointments, executive orders, all that sort of thing, to moving to the idea of wanting an extremely powerful president. And the second quote here is from Bill Barr's memo that he wrote the summer before he was nominated by Trump to become the Attorney General, where Barr said, "It is wrong to conceive of the president as simply the highest officer within the executive branch hierarchy. He alone is the executive branch. As such, he is the sole repository of executive powers conferred by the Constitution." And part of Barr's argument was that really it was be completely up to the president to decide who gets prosecuted, who doesn't get prosecuted, and that included whether he should be investigated or any of the people in his administration or any of his political allies. Now, that's obviously an extremely strong view of the presidency. And, it's impossible to conceive that that would have been acceptable during the Obama administration from a lot of the people who supported it during the Trump years. So, there's this tendency to try to promote distrust towards the person in power, is the institutional power, as was done with Obama, and then flipping when it came to Trump. And the term for that, it's not the term that I made up or Doug Harris made up. It's a term in political sciences, is situational institutionalism. So, where you think the power should be depends on where, what you have, what controls you have. Okay, well, I'm going to move on in a minute to the what should be done or what can we do about any of this sort of thing part of the talk. But before doing so, I wanted to pause and see if we have any questions.
Yeah, Amy, we do have one question. So Steve writes, doesn't skepticism imply not trusting? How does one have healthy exchanges with government without distrusting its people as a basic instinct? I think of the phrase trust but verify from the Reagan era as perhaps a more healthy formulation than skepticism. What's your thoughts on that?
Yeah, I think the trust but verify phrase is actually a good phrase because it really balances those two elements. At least giving maybe trust in terms of a certain benefit of the doubt, while also holding that in abeyance in terms of saying, well, I'm not going to just go along with something simply because somebody came up with it, and I think that's a good balance. Now, as I said, people are going to vary in terms of what level of government they think is, the one that should have the most powers, or under what circumstances it should have the most powers. And it's going to depend on who's in office. All of that stuff, I think, is completely normal. It's really when it turns into this extremely negative view that you don't trust the motivations of people at all, and you you know, and you see them as maybe even more inclined to just be trying to undermine, you know, everything good and wonderful, you know, underline liberties and such. I mean, again, I think with the example of the pandemic public health measures, I mean, there's plenty of reasons to have discussions, arguments back and forth about what's the best thing to be done, but to simply paint them as these are just efforts to exert power over other people, I think, you know, becomes kind of inappropriate.
Yeah. Okay. Yeah, we've got a few more rolling in here. One, Bill asks, where do Black Lives Matter, Antifa, critical race theory advocates, anti-war advocates in the 1960s and 70s fit in your analysis about people weaponizing distrust of America and of USG?
Yeah, and I'm assuming USG is the US government. That's a great question, Bill. And we talk a little bit in the, you know, the more historical period before getting to Reagan, because the second chapter of the book is a really long historical sweep from the founding period. And then chapter 3, we go into Reagan. So we talk about the 60s and the 70s in there. And we say, yes, this is certainly a period where a lot of times the left is very distrustful. And, you know, there are things that are emerging as information that are going to fit with that, like finding out about the CIA's involvement in international coups and, you know, various things that, you know, various bits of information that are coming out at that point. And again, I would also say that, you know, now there are elements of the left that are extremely negative towards the government overall. And also certain people who would be, you know, very distrusting of certain parts of the federal, well, maybe not the federal government, but government in particular, say the criminal justice system. So yeah, absolutely, that's true. And you do see that from the left to some extent. Our argument is not that it doesn't happen or that it isn't warranted sometimes, whether from the left or from the right. Because it's certainly, you know, there are many legitimate arguments, or sometimes when people maybe go too far from either side. But we see it as really the major strategy of the right, or the core strategy of the right, in order to do those four things in terms of institutions, organizations, policy, and elections. That it's you know, it's just become the, you know, a very major part of the strategic approach of conservatives. So I hope that's helpful.
Yeah, and in fact, I think you covered a question from Marge, which really got at the question of, you know, how does this, is there an asymmetric aspect to it between conservatives, liberals, Republicans, Democrats, and so I think you've covered that very well. That it's a matter of who weaponizes it as a political weapon versus maybe some legitimate skepticism. But we do have one more, and I think this is a very interesting one. What's the role of media in weaponizing of the language of distrust? And I suppose I could just add to that, you know, I mean, you've got the media at large, and then I guess you have different segments of the media you may need to address distinctly on that question as well.
Thank you. Yeah, that's another really good question. And you know, yeah, as David put it, it's an asymmetric situation. And some of you may have read or, you know, heard Norm Ornstein, for example. Ornstein and Thomas Mann have written a number of works where they talk about asymmetric polarization. So that, you know, that things are not exactly the same between the two parties, you know, or left versus right. There are these differences, even if there is certainly polarization and some similarities in that dynamic. So yeah, when it comes to the media, yeah, I think the media does play a role in all of this. Some of it is playing up certain kinds of messages and focusing on negative things that happen or negative kinds of messaging. There's some evidence that, you know, that comes down to audience as well, that a lot of times people will respond more to negative news than to positive news. It gets people going. It's, you know, social media certainly, but also through mass media. So, we haven't done the analysis of, you know, going and doing like a very in-depth content analysis of media sources, but you know, we're well aware of some of that research. And, you know, you see in the rise of Newt Gingrich, the importance of talk radio. And, you know, when Republicans won the House for the first time in 40 years for the so-called Republican Revolution of 1994, Gingrich brought into the House a lot of talk show hosts to do a lot of interviews with for certain periods. So we've had that. There certainly are certain media that go with that.
Yeah, and here's another question from Steve, and I think it's one that may be on the minds of many of our viewers, which have ties to the government. So we you know, many of us that have worked in government realize there's a big distinction between political leadership when it comes to whether you're engaged in trustful activities and the people that are actually, you know, in government, the workers that are providing, you know, trying to provide service. And so the question really goes to how do we make people aware of that distinction, and should the media play a part in that in drawing that distinction?
Yeah, that is a really excellent question. It's something I probably would have to think about a little bit more, but I was just recently pondering this whole kind of question because, you know, the creation of a civil service system, which goes back to the progressive era in the United States, so it's 100 or so years old, was a really important step. I mean, it means you don't have people who are working in government positions, you know, at least most of the people working in government positions are not people that are there by virtue of being political appointees. You know, they're people. You know, we got past that system in the United States, where, you know, just to work for the post office or something, you had to be a friend of the party in power. Or, frankly, when I was growing up in New York State, to work at certain beaches in Long Island, you really could not get a job, even a summer job. You know, if you weren't a family wasn't Republican back in those days. That's probably changed. Well, that's not a civil service thing. It doesn't really relate to the 100 years of civil service. But, you know, I think that somehow that's some place where, like, who exactly would do it? It's hard to know who would do the publicity to make that point and make that argument. But I do think that somehow it is something for people to be reminded of, that it is so important to have people in government that's what their job is, to, you know, take care of the business of government. And that, you know, whoever the president is or whoever the governor is, if you're talking about state office, they're going to just try to carry out their jobs. It's really quite an achievement to have created that kind of system, and we should really be proud of it.
Yeah, I guess when everything works, that's not newsworthy. So that's part of the problem, I suppose. But listen, that's I think those are some great questions, and we're going to let Amy go ahead and probably finish out with her presentation, and there'll be an opportunity for questions at the end. So keep putting those into the Q&A function, and we'll come back to a Q&A session at the end. Okay, Amy, all yours.
Okay, great. And yeah, those were wonderful questions. Thank you so much. Going on. So what can be done? So the main thing that I would argue, and this is chapter 7 of the book, is that we can develop alternative strategies that, as I said early on, are evidence-based things that will promote trust in government, that are focused on the same things that the distrustful strategies have been focused upon. Building organizations and coalitions, providing messages to wage election campaigns, reshaping institutional power, and waging policy battles. So what specific things then should be done? So when it comes to political organizations, there's a lot of work that's been done over the years that argues or sort of demonstrates the importance to have political organizations that are going to bring in new kinds of people and mentoring new members and new leaders. And in the book, I talk about some efforts to reach out to people from working class backgrounds. Some of these are from unions. There's other kinds of groups. There's groups involving a lot of women, people who have seen the impact, some of the positive impacts of government, not to say that they completely trust government, because I said that would be, you know, kind of absurd, and we want people to be skeptical, but bringing in new people who will be able to see things in a somewhat different way, and to try to have parties operate and local parties operate in an ongoing way through the course of the year, and not just during election time, to involve people and to educate them a bit about how government works. And it doesn't have to be parties that do this. I have a lot of connections, linkages with the Maine League of Women Voters. They're just now putting out a wonderful guide on local government and how local government works. They do a great election publication, and they're trying to do some door-to-door work, talking to people about issues that are important to them. So, you know, really trying to think about this in an ongoing way, in ways that are going to connect with people and get them interested, which relates then to a few elements specifically that have to do with elections and election coalitions. And there's some people may have heard of this thing called the race class narrative or race class narrative project. These are these messages that try to say we're all in it together, and that explicitly will talk about the need to come together to do things as a group. Because as I said, government is a way to tackle public problems, but do people feel that they are part of a larger public, right? I mean, that's something that there was a big effort to do, to promote this idea of unity and togetherness and, you know, patriotism. That's something that happened a lot during the Second World War. There was a lot of effort to do that. And people did feel connected to each other. But scholars sometimes say, okay, people may feel connected to each other and unified at a time where there's a lot of difficulty facing everybody during the Depression, during World War II, but is it possible to get beyond that at other times, to build bonds together, both not only politically, but also to reduce social distrust? So I was gonna play for you a little clip from an ad that a group using a underlying set of ideas did a few years ago in a Minnesota campaign.
In Minnesota, we know long winters, and we know how to dig our neighbors out of the snow. Because whether it's our first Minnesota winter or our 50th, we've all been there. So when certain politicians want to divide us and make us afraid, we know that means they've got nothing else to offer. We're on to them. There are lots of ways to be Minnesotan, and all of them are greater than fear. In Minnesota, we're better off together. Vote greater than fear between now and November 6th.
So you can see in that video that idea that people have things that bind them together, that connect them to each other. So it's explicitly making that kind of argument and saying, you know, although, you know, there's differences between people, just like we may come together to clear the snow, we can do other things together. And some of those have been useful and helpful in election campaigns. Okay, so can you see my PowerPoint slide now?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Good. Okay, managed to do that. Okay, so another thing in terms of promoting trust also relates to this idea of connecting to different people. And here I have a little bit about specifically an effort by a candidate in a very, very rural state legislative district in Maine, Chloe Maxman, who, you know, went out and talked to lots and lots of people, including people who tended to be excluded a lot of times from that kind of connection. And she has this forthcoming book here, Dearth Road Revival, and this is a little quote from an article about her. But you know, in this little quote from this article, she's talking about going down and knocking on the door of this trailer, and this man saying to her after they spoke for a while, "You're the first person to listen to me. Everyone judges what my house looks like. They don't bother to knock. I'm grateful you came. I'm going to vote for you." So the ability of people to get beyond campaigns that are simply run on media, often creating outrage about individuals or about, you know, issues and politics in general, is something that can have an impact in terms of moving people and creating trust among people. And, you know, in this kind of canvassing, she was talking to people about not only what, you know, they cared about, what their issues were, listening to them, but talking a bit about what ideas she had to do something about it. You know, she ended up being successful in this congressional district, and you know, and because she took the time and took the effort. And these are not the kind of conversations that a lot of times people have at doors, where they just knock on somebody's door, they ask who they're going to vote for, they, you know, indicate that either on, you know, say some kind of device or on a piece of paper, and then they go on from there, or, you know, just tell them where there is to vote. It's these longer kinds of conversations with people that take a lot of time, and therefore a lot of investment of time. But that there are indications, both from these individual kind of cases with this candidate, but also more you know, people have done experimental designs and tried different things that do seem to make some difference. I also, when it comes to the institutional matters, to try to, instead of simply, you know, playing with the institutions, moving power towards the ones that you control and the ways from you don't control, by looking at the underlying institutional structures and trying to make sure that they do protect democracy. There's a phrase you may have heard that voters should choose candidates, candidates shouldn't choose voters, right? But when you have this intensive gerrymandering, you have candidates and political parties choosing voters. And what happens from that is you have an intensification of whatever the politics would be in that district. Most districts, or many districts, are safe districts, so it's always going to be a Republican who wins or a Democrat who wins. And so really the big arguments that happen are the arguments, the ones that matter the most in the primaries, and usually the more extreme candidate is going to win. So if you want to reduce the intensity of politics, and you have to have more competitive districts, and one of the tools for that is gerrymandering. That's not the only thing we talk about in terms of institutional power, but that is one of them. Okay, and then when it comes to policy battles, if you're talking about people who want government to do things, then those have to be policies that the policies that tend to be most popular are ones that are universal or expandable. For example, Social Security is an extremely popular policy. Medicare is a very popular policy because it is universal, at least for, obviously people of a certain age. Also policies that can ramp up in certain ways, but Americans in general tend to like policies that they see as promoting opportunity, so that people have put something into it and then they can get something out of it. So education, supporting education is important because then people can work hard, they can, achieve based on their education. Those sorts of things are policy battles and policies that tend to do very well. Also, people have a better feel for policies that don't have a lot of red tape, or what political scientists and people in public administration call administrative burdens, that are relatively easy to access, don't have a lot of difficulties in getting to it. Or if you have policies that do have a lot of administrative burdens, reducing them so that they're easier to access, and then people tend to feel better about them. So, one policy area where people have really tried to reduce administrative burdens, and did do this to some extent, are when we're talking about higher education. Anyone who's been a parent in any recent years with kids in college, you have to fill out the FAFSA form. It used to be incredibly complex. It's much easier to do now. And there's ways to feed in information from the Social Security Administration. So things that are designed with few administrative burdens are going to make people feel better about those programs because it's, they're just not so annoying. And also policies that are competently carried out. I mean, just simply doing things well is a way to improve the reputation of government and improve trust in government. I say here also policies that can be easily seen. Some things that we do are done in ways that are very hard for people to almost recognize as being things that are government. Things that are done through the tax code, things that are very much in the background. So things that people can recognize that this is something that was done that made some difference in people's lives, can also promote trust in government. It's been well known for about 50 years among political scientists that people tend to be much more prone to say, even when they don't like government, then they like certain programs. However, some programs end up being very popular. As I said, things like Social Security, Medicare, even Medicaid, very, very popular programs, but then people will say they don't, really like government. The same thing goes with regulation, which is a way of restricting private power. People say they don't like regulations, but then they like an awful lot of regulations when it comes to environment, say. So things that can be more recognized, well done, designed with few administrative burdens, and promoting opportunity tend to be things that are going to promote more trust and more confidence in government. And there's a lot more than this in the book. So if you haven't read it, I hope this whetted your appetite for it. Just the final word before turning this over to David and then taking questions after he has a few things to tell you about, is that I see two key aspects for 2022 this year. One is really to try to make government work well. And there's a very interesting report from the Niskanen Center, State Capacity, What It Is, How We Lost It, How to Get It Back, that has a lot of good ideas about that whole question. And they are, I don't know, they're a group that's hard to pigeonhole ideologically, I'd say. They're a very interesting group. And this is a very interesting report. And then also with the elections coming up, something I've mentioned as important, but I'll reiterate, listening to, connecting, and communicating with voters in a more deep way is a good thing that could be done, because it's very hard to just sort of see someone in this completely negative way if you've had an extensive conversation with them. You get past that kind of just, surface negativity. So with that, I will thank you and ask for questions. But first, I'm turning it over to David.
Yeah, thanks, Amy, and thanks for some of those positive ideas, and something that we hope to see going forward in the future. And so, before we get to Q&A, okay, so we have a back recording. Okay, so now Jack writes, I've heard it argued that the GOP has been focused on grassroots organizing for years, while the Dems have ignored local organization. How would you evaluate that, or do you agree with that, I guess, for the first thing?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I think it depends on where you're talking about. I mean, there are certainly states where you might see that, and others where you don't. And there are some states where there's very, very active Democratic organizing. The Democratic Party of Wisconsin is now led by, I can't believe I forgot his name, but it's the person who leads it was the president of Move On, and he's a very, very good organizer. And they have done an enormous amount of work in really bringing up their efforts. And then if you look at Georgia with Stacey Abrams, she's been active for a very long time in doing a great deal of organizing and doing a great deal of work on voter registration and get out the vote, and also in making sure that people have their ballots. Any ballots that are rejected after an election can be cured, as the word goes, that people can fix their ballots. So, and I know that in Georgia also, Abrams was very active after the Affordable Care Act was passed, and getting people to go around and talk to people who could sign up for coverage. So not just depending on the navigator programs that a lot of states had to help people. So it really depends on the state, I think. I'd say in 2020, in a lot of states, Republicans did do a lot more door-to-door work, because Democrats, a lot of times, because of the pandemic, didn't go out and knock on doors, and that could have had an impact on the outcome of a number of races. As I'm sure people on this call, at this event know, although Biden won the presidency, Democrats did not do as well in congressional races as a lot of people had thought they would, including in Senate races, and that could have been in part due to lesser activities in the door-to-door stuff. But then if you look at the two Georgia Senate races, which made such a difference in control of the Senate, that is a state where, as I said, people were incredibly active. For example, I saw I think it was on CNN, the day that the election was called for Biden, which was a Saturday, and people were outside a lot. There were all these public celebrations. The Abrams organization in Georgia was going around with clipboards, making sure that people were registered to vote, because they knew that there were going to be these runoff elections. So, there's some places where there's been a great deal of attention to grassroots activities from Democrats, and others where it's been less so.
Yeah, here's an interesting question. I think, in general, it's true that you find maybe both parties sometimes using a phrase and either making it positive or putting a negative spin on a phrase that another party has used. And here's an interesting example. It says the conservatives in the Virginia election weaponized coming together. So I think she means, when the Democrat used that term, and they were very successful in the Virginia election. But then, as soon as they won, they started the mantra, "Now it's time for everyone to come together." So it was, I guess, weaponized against the Democrats and then used as a positive spin. I think that's what Susan is getting at. So you can address that specific example, or maybe in general how different phrases are used as a weapon, positive or negative.
I think that is a really good point. You definitely can, and I think that gets back to my point about skepticism about government being important. I mean, I remember the days, after the Iraq War was started, where, if you criticized the war, you were labeled as unpatriotic and everyone was supposed to support the war. So there are times when these calls for coming together or patriotism can really be a thinly veiled attempt to try to get people not to express their views when they disagree. This terms trust and distrust are kind of slippery in a way. It doesn't mean loyalty or, fealty or taking a pledge to support things altogether. And it's going to be used by both sides in ways that sometimes are hypocritical.
Yeah, and here's a comment, and if you'd like to react to it. So, I mean, Ava points out that after World War II, you say everyone kind of came together, but when you look below the surface, I mean, there was still racism, segregation, and of course we interned Japanese citizens during World War II. Also, a lot of the men that came back then displaced women in the workforce. So I guess it kind of gets to the definition of coming together when you have a lot of other things, undercurrents going on in society.
Yeah, Eva, I think that's a really, really good point. In that my second book, the Pathways to Polling book, I have all these polls that were done about the internment of Japanese Americans that the federal government did to try to support, find out what people were thinking and then develop support for it. You did have a segregated military all through the war. You don't have desegregation of the armed forces until after the war. Truman announces that he wants to desegregate the armed forces in 1948, and then it takes a long time to do that. But I'd say, I guess, two different things about that. Maybe more will pop into my head, but two that come to my mind right now. One is we're talking in relative terms. So overall, the public did have more faith and trust in government in that period. So there was greater trust in government despite all these, really horrible things that were going on, and, racist sorts of things that were going on. But another would be simply that when you look at the populations of people who were suffering from these behaviors in the federal government, these terrible behaviors, they were trying to become, they were making the argument that they are citizens too. And they were using a lot of the language of patriotism in terms of wanting to enter as part of a kind of broader national community. So for example, you had campaigns against segregation of the armed forces even during World War II from the Black press. So there's a famous poster from a Pittsburgh newspaper that was a Black newspaper, Black-owned newspaper with a Black audience, which said, double V campaign, victory at home and abroad. So like saying the victory against fascism wasn't just in the war against Hitler and Mussolini, but also we could have victory against fascism by ending segregation and moving against other kinds of racist and white supremacist kinds of things. So it's picking up those same kinds of things, like what does it mean? We are Americans too. And then thinking of the brigade of Japanese Americans, of people who had parents who were still in internment camps, but they were going to go and fight. And they were going to say, we're part of this effort here to try to overcome, the Axis powers. So I don't, I'm not in any way denying that all of these things happen, but I'm just sort of pointing to the uses of the messages of unity by people who had been excluded from it. So they're not saying, well, we hate, government is all bad, it's completely illegitimate. It's saying, we want to be part of this national story. We want to be written into the national story. There's a great line in the Hamilton musical that the women sing at the end of, a group of women sing at the end of it, who gets written into the story. We want to be in that story. We don't want to tear down the government. We don't want to tear down the country. We want to make it better by being a part of it. And as I said, also, most people, the levels of trust were much higher in those days overall.
Yeah, here's Steve has a suggestion here on how to maybe change the perspective that people have of government, or government workers at least, and that is that we could potentially provide examples where government civil servants have done, positive things. And I mean, it wouldn't be too hard to find. I think that happens every day, and recognize them as society's true leaders, kind of behind the scenes, messaging. And so what do you think of that? And I guess how would that be, maybe how do you think we would accomplish that?
That is a great idea. I am not 100% sure who would do it, because it's hard to, maybe public sector unions would do it. That's a possibility. Because otherwise, I'm not really, I can't see expending government funds for something like that. It could be that if there was some campaign to do this that was organized by a group or organized by some unions, that people could be at least writing op-eds and letters and, trying to get more attention to what people in public positions are doing. But it's hard. I mean, we know that election workers, for example, have been under attack in various ways. So, there's certain parts of, underlying public sector, part of our government, it just has been really presented in, the negative way possible.
Okay, and here's a question and a comment, I guess. We certainly have had a lot of efforts to decertify the election or overturn the election, and I guess some of the polls have shown that about half of the Republican voters believe that the election was stolen, whatever they think that means in their own minds, and that Trump is still rightly the president. So the question that Ed has is, when faced with that kind of position for a good chunk of the population, where they say black is white and up is down, how do you kind of push through and get a different message to that group?
Yeah, that is a really, really tough question. And it may be some people will not be reached. Some people are not going to change. And, I've certainly seen all of those polls. And, it took a long time to get to the point that people believe this. And, Doug Harris and I wrote a piece right before the election, where we went through all of the things that Trump had said about past elections. I mean, even when he was running in primaries in 2016, he was saying that there was cheating going on, and anytime he didn't win in some state, it was stolen from him. You know, he had been doing this sort of thing for a very long time, and there's been a very long effort to cast doubt on election systems and promote the idea that fraud is widespread. And you know, I think there's probably going to be some people who will, you know, not deal with the reality of what happened. You know, that the election was legitimate, that rates of fraud are very, very low. But on the other hand, most of the population does accept the legitimacy of the election. They don't think that fraud is endemic. You know, and so, you know, sometimes we're in situations where we're going to get a fair number of people who believe things that aren't true. You know, sometimes they're more politically powerful than others. It's more of a problem if they're helping to make decisions. But you know, that does, you know, that can happen. But you know, like all through the Obama, you know, or through big periods of the Obama presidency, there was about, you know, close to 30% of the population that believed this birther idea that he wasn't born in the United States. So, you know, probably a lot of those people still hold to that view. But if you have 30% that believes one thing, that still means 70% don't. So, you know, I guess it's one of those, you know, is the glass 1/3 full, or you know, or 1/3 empty, or 70% full in that in that kind of situation. But you know, we are in a situation where people are in their own bubbles to such an extent with media, social media, etc., that these, you know, false ideas get reinforced, and it's very hard to figure out what to do about that. I think sometimes this person-to-person stuff does make a difference, though, where people will, if they're talking to another individual and they're talking about something that matters in their own life, it can help them at least make a different kind of connection. But you know, otherwise, I don't think, there's some people whose minds are made up, they're just not going to change.
Yeah, now it's a purely a political question, and I mean, you can take it on if you like. So, I mean, somewhat political, but so the question is that a lot of talk about the red-blue divide, but what about shades of blue? So, you know, in other words, GOP messaging has been, until recently, remarkably uniform and successful in affecting political and cultural change, but not so with the Democrats, with the fractious discussion over Build Back Better. And I mean, I'll just add, I mean, I you know, the whole, it's been a long-standing joke that I'm not a member of an organized party, I'm a Democrat. And of course, the last couple of presidential elections, you've certainly seen a single-mindedness with the Republicans around the Supreme Court and getting someone that will nominate. So I don't know if you agree with the premise that Republicans are more organized, or if you want to take that on, but handle that however you like.
Yeah, I think this is it's an important point, and it really comes down to, you know, what do the coalitions of the political parties look like, and how do you manage coalitions? You know, how do you grow a coalition? How do you develop a coalition? And, you know, most, I'd say, political scientists would say that Democrats have tended to be a more fractious coalition. We have our political parties are coalitions in the United States because they're so large, right? If you have a country that has lots and lots of political parties that can get elected, at least get some seats in the national legislature, then those political parties can be, you know, much more unified, very unified, very homogeneous. But the United States, because we tend to have two political parties, which is basically all due to our electoral system, which is like a whole long story in itself. But we have, instead of having coalition governments that are between political parties that come together, like let's say in, Israel or Italy, we have coalitions within political parties. But those coalitions, do look different, the Democratic coalition, the Republican coalition. In both cases, you have different attempts to bring in new groups, and then sometimes other groups depart. So the Roosevelt coalition, or the so-called New Deal coalition, included the white South. No longer really is part of the part of the Democratic coalition, but then it's become, the Democratic Party has become a very diverse political party in terms of race, and has a lot of differences within it. I would say, though, even though I would say the Republican Party is more homogeneous than the Democratic Party, there are differences within the Republican Party. And one of the things that we talk about in the book, that a point that I did not make, is that in some ways, the efforts to weaponize distrust in government have come back to hurt or to become a bit of a hindrance to the more establishment mainstream Republicans, who still do exist to some extent. So during the Tea Party era, for example, a lot of primaries that were Republican primaries that were won by Tea Party candidates then became unwinnable in the general election. So it's not as if the Republicans are completely without their coalition challenges. They sometimes do have them. But overall, the Democratic Party is a more heterogeneous party, no doubt.
Okay, I think we've reached the bewitching hour, but this has been a riveting discussion. I learned a lot, and we so thank you so much. Thank you for joining us, Amy, all the way from Maine. I don't know if you mentioned that earlier, and I want to thank the audience for sacrificing what is a gorgeous spring day to be with us. And we had some great questions that helped delve even deeper into the subject. So I just, Amy, if you have any closing comments, I'll kick it back to you before I close things out.
No, I just wanted to thank you. These were really excellent questions. And I also appreciate the idea about promoting civil servants and raising up those individuals who are working as part of the government. As I said at one point, having a nonpartisan civil service system was a big development, an important development in the United States. And I think people don't sometimes, take the time to appreciate that, or may not even know about it. I think it's going to take more than education to make a difference with all of this, making improvements in government, reaching out to voters. All of that is going to matter, among other things. And again, thank you so much for having me. And I enjoyed this very much.
Okay, great. Thanks again.